Good afternoon, everybody. Before we get started, may I remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live via the internet and a recording archived for future viewing. We can move to item 1 on the agenda, apologies for absence. I've had apologies from Councillor Matthew Lloyd. I don't believe there'll be any other apologies looking at the room. Okay, moving on to minutes of the last meeting.
Move the minutes, Chair.
Move, thank you. Can I go around the room? Any declarations? Seconder? Yeah. Thank you. Any declarations of interest? No, thank you very much. Item 4, report of the last site inspections. Move and notes. Seconded, thank you. Item 5, building regulation applications under delegated powers. Thank you. Planning applications determined under delegated powers. Thank you. Item 7, appeals. Marcus, did you want to?
I've got nothing to add on this, Chair. No.
No. Okay, happy to note those. Thank you. Trees, our delegated list under trees. Moved and notes. Thank you. Item 9, our annual performance reports. Marcus.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is a report we have to produce every year for Welsh Government, which runs through various indices in respect of planning, which the department is measured against. I don't intend going through it all in detail because it is quite a long and in-depth report. A couple of key indicators just for noting in terms of efficiency. We are taking on average 60 days to determine all planning applications. That 60 days includes majors, minors and householder applications, and that actually puts us third in Wales in terms of determination speeds, below the Welsh average of 76 days. And indeed, if you look at the authorities who are ahead of us in that table, obviously they're generally smaller authorities, and Bregenda just behind us. So that's good to note. You'll also note that in terms of determining all applications within the required timescale, we are achieving a good standard with 91% of all planning applications determined within the required timescales. That is compared to an average of 87 across Wales, so again we're above the average there. And I think one of the key to note is the 96% figure for householder planning applications. Flicking through the report, one of the issues which perhaps last year we were a bit more disappointed with was the appeals decisions, and you will note that actually only 52% of appeals were dismissed, which means that 48% were allowed. Unfortunately, I think you've probably heard me talk about this before, that figure was skewed by a particular site where we took enforcement action and had planning applications, and ultimately it led to a number of decisions on one site coming in, and as you'll note, there's actually, I think it's only 26 appeals over the year. So if you have a number on one site, it can skew the figures quite a lot. So while we did a very good year the year before, that did unfortunately affect us quite badly there. But in all other respects, the performance is very good, well above Welsh average. And indeed, this is the first year we've been able to say we have an LDP. Page 55 points that out and gives us a date for an annual monitoring review. So that is good news. So I'm happy to take questions if any members have got questions on the report. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Marcus, for that introduction. Most of this is a technical Welsh Government benchmark, so I'm not going to. There's not many queries on those. I want to draw people's attention, though, to what's on page 60, section 3 quality, which is a benchmark about percentage of member-made decisions against officer advice. I can understand and see why that might be there, but I would like to draw attention, first of all, to the paragraph of notes beneath it, which says the Council has a number of major and controversial planning applications which were recommended for approval by officers and overturned for refusal in the run-up to the local government elections in May 2017. I wasn't a member of this committee in 16-17, although some people around this table were. I do regard that as being slightly offensive because I think the suggestion is there that they made decisions based around the focus on the local elections rather than planning decisions. So I'm concerned as to the implications of that point about the local government elections. That shouldn't be relevant. I'm sure that wasn't relevant to decisions being made by this planning committee or by members making those. So I don't believe that should be there. The broader point I will make, as always, is that this is part of a supposedly democratic process, and we are requested as, we are here as representatives to make decisions. So the suggestion of a benchmark more generally about percentage of member-made decisions against officer advice is, I find, slightly awkward, because either I'm here to make decisions or I'm not. I don't believe I'm here to rubber stamp officer advice, even though that may be very good. We're here to make decisions as a committee, and I find this a problematic benchmark. I accept and appreciate that it's probably a Welsh Government benchmark, but I do find the idea of rating us according to whether or not we agree with officers to be a very strange way of deciding how effective this planning committee is. Thank you.
Yeah, Marcus, sorry.
Yeah, just to point out, yes, you are correct, Councillor. It is a Welsh Government set framework which we have to respond to each of those questions. I understand what you're saying. Unfortunately, we have to give a reason to Welsh Government as to why that figure is there. It is just a statement of fact. The inferences can be drawn if they wish, but we are stating a fact at the run-up to that election. We had gone through a period where we had I think, 4 years with 0%. So the question has to be answered. I'm afraid that's what what is put in there is just a statement of fact.
Any other councillors? Councillor Thomas. Turn your microphone on.
On that point, Marcus, it's you have drawn a connection between the number of controversial applications which were considered by the committee and a time. They aren't necessarily related. I take Councillor Johnson's point about looking at this, and that you seem to have made an inference that those two, and it certainly made an implication within this, that those two things are connected when there is no establishable connection.
Thank you, Councillor. I just refer you back to the statement of fact. The timing is a matter of when the survey was carried out, so it's a timing of a survey taken from April 16 to April 17. Therefore, those are factors that are just included within that box.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you for that, Marcus. I wouldn't want to labour the point, but the sentence gains nothing by including in the run-up to the local government elections, May 2017, and loses nothing by deleting that point. Simply saying the council has a number of major and controversial planning applications, which may well have been the case, establishes the reason for it, for any refusals, in suggesting that they are different to the previous years. To include the phrase in the run-up to the local government elections, May 2017, may be factual, but it does leave an inference there that I've taken on board, and maybe other people reading this might, and if that wasn't your intention, then perhaps it shouldn't be there. Thank you.
Peter, sorry.
As somebody who was on the planning committee then, I do take offence at this. I think if you wish to say during the term of office and of the year of 16-17, that is also factually correct, and I would be much happy if it did, because I think reading this, it does look as though that there was something else going on, and I certainly did not vote any differently because of facing an election.
This report has already gone to Welsh Government. This is for members to note. I think the general consensus appreciates that, although there's a statement of facts there, the way that dates are described is perhaps where there's some controversy within the committee, and perhaps when looking at future we should try and remove descriptions about dates if we're going to be talking about a period of time when we're referring to that in the future. I think that could be a sensible suggestion. Councillor Johnson.
As this is an annual report within a certain, so it has to be submitted within a certain time scale, would not make sense for it to come to this committee prior to submission to Welsh Government rather than afterwards. Asking us to note and rubber stamp a document that's already gone is interesting, but not ultimately useful in any way that we can have any impact upon it.
Marcus?
I take that on board. Unfortunately, a lot of these figures are worked out literally. We get the framework at the end of September. We have to submit it within 2 weeks to Welsh Government. So it is almost impossible within the timescales we get it to do it in that way. And the questions have changed again for next year. So it is the framework has changed again for next year as we understand it. We don't yet know what the question will be, but it will change. So we can endeavour, but I can't guarantee it because, unfortunately, the timescales are very, very tight when we have to submit this.
Councillor Baird.
Chair, as per the recommendation, I move the committee notes.
Seconded. All in favour? Any against? Any abstentions? Thank you. Moving on to planning applications, item 10 on our agenda. First planning application is 2014/00995/FUL, land adjacent to Llantwit Major bypass in Boverton. Marcus.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is an application for 65 houses on a site just off the Llantwit Major bypass. Just to point out, there is one amendment to a condition in the matters for consideration. That is in respect of condition 16. Just to explain, that condition dealt with ecology issues and the need or otherwise for a licence to be submitted for work on the site. Natural Resources Wales have pointed out to us that there is a reference in the condition to a roost, and actually it has not been confirmed there is a roost on the site, so we have changed roost to site, if that makes sense. So it is just literally changing the condition 16 to take the reference to roost out and put the reference site in. So that's the only late representation. As I say, it's for 65 dwellings. The site is an allocated site within the LDP. The application that has come in and has been with us for some time is for part of the allocation, not for all of it. And if you look at the plan that's on the screen now, the last corner here excluded, if I put the mouse, this corner here is also within the allocation within the LDP, but hasn't been included due, I understand, to the applicant's inability to get the landowner to agree to either sell or involve themselves with this application. So that has been part of the reason why this has been a very long-standing application. We have been trying to encourage the applicant to submit a comprehensive application. That has not been possible. Nevertheless, we have looked at this development and consider that the fact that's not there does not prevent it from being developed in the future. There is a road shown and a road link shown, and it will be a matter to be resolved between the various landowners as to when that particular part of the application comes in. The site is identified in the LDP as MG2/22, land adjacent to Llantwit Major bypass. The proposals are for a relatively straightforward development with an access off the B4265, single access. That access will feed a linear type development within the site, and a number of private drives are shown off that. As part of the development, a footpath link is proposed on the other side of the bypass, which will be constructed by the developers on land owned by the council to provide a footpath link into Llantwit Major. In terms of the key issues, obviously we have to have regard to the fact the site is allocated within the LDP. We have to have regard to the fact that it is current agricultural land and the impact that appearance will have. Obviously, highway safety and junction issues and increased traffic associated with the development, possible impact on neighbour amenities, parking, amenity space and open space, the tenure of houses, other standard issues such as archaeology, drainage, and obviously Section 106. Those issues are all addressed in the report, and I'll be happy to take questions from anyone in respect of any of those if there are any concerns. just to point out in one particular regard to section 106, a package has been agreed with the developer which shows a 29.23% of affordable housing on the site. That's 19 dwellings for everyone here. That is actually just slightly below the requirement that would have existed at the time this application came in, which is 2014, and it would have been a 30% requirement. But is also actually over 5% below the current requirement, which is 35% for Lantwick Major. The developer obviously is in a tricky position because they submitted this application before in the course of the consideration, these figures have changed. And so they have submitted a viability report which shows that at 35% the development would not be viable. That has been ratified by the district valuer. But what they have done is to achieve the 30% figure that would have been the requirement when they submitted this application, they have agreed to a submission of additional funds of £59,449, which actually takes it up to the 30% figure with a cash contribution to be used for affordable housing. So having regards to the viability and that, we do consider this, and the fact this application has been with us for over 3 years, we do consider that to be an acceptable solution. There are other contributions, including £576,000 for enhanced education facilities, open space on site, including 2 local areas of play, a contribution of £64,000 towards community facilities, and a contribution of £130,000 for enhanced sustainable transport facilities, in addition to the path which I referred to earlier. So on the basis of that, we are recommending approval.
Thank you, Marcus. I'd like to ask Councillor Gwyn John to come up and address the committee, please. You'll have 3 minutes, Gwyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, it's becoming quite a habit, my coming along, and I'm not the Grim Reaper tonight because I'm quite happy with the application. I've got no problems with the application, only one issue, and that is the access onto the bypass. Now, everybody knows that Lantwick Major, using this bypass, it's a very fast road heading down towards the lights at Boverton. And my concern is that I've discussed this with Highways, and whilst they accept that they intend putting a right-hand turning block in the middle of the chevrons that are on that road at the moment, at the same time, coming out of that junction at peak times could create a huge problem, particularly people gambling to come across that road. And that is the issue. Now, I have raised this a while ago about coming out of the West Camp gate, the existing access which goes on to West Camp, which was once used by about 14,000 airmen. But that access coming onto the main road there gives you a very good visibility, and it gives you a very good way to go off that left if you're going to Barry, so you don't have to gamble again coming out the current access. Whilst I've been discussing this for some time, yesterday I had a visit. I had a visit from the owner of the second phase site, which we just mentioned. And the owner for the second phase site is shortly going to put the application in. And her and her family have suggested to me yesterday that they would agree to the access going through their site for the whole site. In other words, they'd be quite happy for the whole area to come with an access onto Westgate and not the current access, because she too considers the current access as a dangerous access. And God forbid anyone taking a chance coming out of there. And let's be fair, you can't really assess traffic speeds when you're coming out of junctions at sometimes. And I would hate to think there was ever a serious accident on that bypass. And we've got to remember now the frustrations that people may have coming along that road, because there's going to be 4 junctions along that road now within the space of half a mile, because you granted the Northern Access Road junction not long ago. So what I'm asking you this afternoon is, this owner of phase 2 is quite prepared to meet with Barrett to discuss the access coming off through her land to Westgate. So all the traffic would come through one area. They'd have a filter then to go towards Barry, and they'd only have the right-hand turn down the bypass. So that's why I'm suggesting to you this afternoon. I know the application's in front of you, but we must, I feel, make some effort to try and resolve this. I would hate to think, I've lived there all my life, and I would hate to think, and anyone using that road knows how fast it is. So please, councillors, this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. So any points of clarification from the committee? Councillor Bird.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor John. Could I just question you? Do you not think if the access was an issue, they'd be better off coming onto the northern access road, and that maybe the owner of the other land is only offering that because they wouldn't have to pay the other developer?
What are we clarifying, Councillor Bird?
Well, I'd just like to clarify if the thought has been given to the other access.
Well, first of all, I don't know how you're going to get to the northern access road from there, because this is easterly of the Boverton Lights. The northern access road is coming down the bypass.
I think we've established that there's maybe another option, but that's not necessarily a clarification of something he said within the statement.
Yeah.
With the debate. Councillor Johnson.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Sorry, I'm just trying to clarify what Councillor John is asking us to do this afternoon in terms of this application. Is he asking us to refuse it on that basis, or is he asking us to pass it or ask for some form of amendments about something which haven't been brought forward to this committee? Which I don't really quite understand what he's attempting for us to achieve. Happy to take that question of clarification.
Councillor John.
I'm not asking you to object the application at all. All I'm suggesting that you can make some form of amendment, a condition, whatever you can make to bring these two parties together. Because I'm sure that if I lived on that site, to be honest with you, I wouldn't want to live on that site. If I was coming onto that bypass, I think it's going to hinder, in the long term, the sale of the houses there.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Johns. That answers the clarification. I mean, in terms of conditions or... Margaret, sorry.
Surely we're looking at this application. We can't put any other turn on it at all. We're looking at this application.
Yeah, it's approve, reject or defer. Those are the three things we have in front of us. Thank you. Anyone else? Thank you, Councillor John. Marcus.
I'll only...
We're not in the general debate yet because we haven't heard from the applicant yet. That's why I was trying to keep it to clarification. Thank you.
And just for clarification, page 83 does include the Highways Officer's comments, who has considered this junction and hasn't raised objections, subject to the conditions that are there. So just for clarification, that point.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Mrs. Zoe Aubrey up to speak in favour of the application. Once you've got yourself settled up there, you press the button on to talk. You'll have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, councillors. I'm just going to really try and address the comments that are new to myself. I would say that, we've been working on this site for 3 years now since the application was submitted, and a significant amount of the delay was when the planning officers asked us to go away and see if we could secure a position on the additional land. However, we weren't able to do that, and hence, we're coming to committee three years after submitting the application. It does raise concerns that the other landowner is now trying to make suggestions that prevent our development coming forward. We've also gone through a detailed exercise with the highway officers. We've submitted very detailed information on the access, almost up to the requirements of a section 278 agreement, to confirm how the amendments tie into the existing highway. And in terms of safeguarding safety, there is a requirement for additional speed surveys to be undertaken to inform the finalised design of the access to the site. And the speed surveys that have been undertaken, that are in the TA that supports the application, confirms that cars aren't getting up to 50 miles per hour along that road due to the traffic lights at either end of our site. So I do do urge you to, approve the application in accordance with, officers' recommendations tonight, because we spent a long time getting to this position. We're keen to bring forward, much needed housing in the Vale of Glamorgan. So, and the other thing I would say, just, I'm not a highways engineer, but actually the access that the council's referring to, it's not very far back from the road and a set of traffic lights to your right, and there's a railway bridge to the left. So I'm pretty sure when you looked at it in detail, you couldn't achieve the appropriate visibility displays. But again, this has been, presented as a new issue tonight. So, but I would say that's very tight in terms of creating the visibility displays you need. And it's almost on a bend as well. So, I would urge you to approve the application before you tonight in accordance with the officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone on the committee have any points of clarification they'd like to ask Mrs. Aubrey? Nope. Thank you very much. Now moving to debating the application. Councillor Bird.
Yeah, I'd just like to clarify, it was the Eglwys-Brewis Road, not the Northern Access Road I was just talking about. But, I mean, highways have got no problems with the proposed access. I don't see it being an issue. I just see that Councillor John has been talked to, because there's obviously a difficulty in paying for access into the other site, which they would have to do. So I think we should discount, all thoughts of other accesses, because we've got one that's satisfactory, has been agreed by our highway engineers, and it works for the site. So I don't think we should get into these wrangles.
Councillor Parker.
Yeah, I mean, the Cambridgeshire case, which is what they're referring to, has no validity at all with this application. I'd actually move officer's recommendation.
Thank you. And second, Councillor Bird. Councillor King.
I have to accept that the highway officers do not express a concern. I'm less troubled by the cars than I am pedestrians, because if there's a roadway goes out in the middle of that new estate, that's where I would think most pedestrians will walk out, and then they will be crossing. They will be attempting to cross the road there, as opposed to being steered elsewhere. I know there's an alternative, but human nature being what it is, you always take the shortest possible route. But as the highway engineer, the highway officers have not flagged it up. I have to accept that they don't seem to think it's a concern. I do.
Thank you, Councillor King. Just come up from Marcus, then I'll come to you, Councillor Johnson.
I understand where Councillor King has come from. Just to point out on this plan, there is a pedestrian route shown from the site going out onto Eglwys-Brewis Road, actually, and then down to where there are obviously crossing facilities already on site. But there is that's probably the safest route to get there. I'm sure there is that issue, but obviously our highway engineers have accepted that.
Councillor Johnson.
I was going to be making a similar point, which is about active travel in general, which is that this appears to be a car-dominated development, and that might be something that you would anticipate on the outskirts of town like this. But I would be interested, sort of about. I mean, that's obviously a sort of a footpath cycleway that's being put in place. I'm just wondering how this fits into the wider active travel network for the area, given the proximity with Eglwys-Brewis, the other side of the railway line, and that. Thanks.
Marcus.
I think I'd say obviously our highway engineers do look at the issue of active travel as well as part of their remit. I think we have to recognise there are certain sites where there are a lot of constraints which make active travel solutions perhaps not optimal. We're looking here at a site which is bounded on one side by a railway line, bounded on the other side by the bypass, and obviously has to have an access road in there. So I don't think anyone would necessarily say it is the perfect solution, but the developers have worked with our own highway engineers to come up with a number of solutions which do achieve active travel solutions there, including that footpath out onto Eglwys-Brewis Road, and obviously the additional pathway down south of the bypass road behind the existing houses across council land to provide a link through into Lantwick Major, which is a safe route.
Councillor Bird.
Could I just clarify, could Marcus clarify, that the footpath the other side will come all the way up to the lights? So when people cross at the Eglwys Brewis crossing, that the footpath then comes all the way down the other side? Because it's not really shown on our drawings, but obviously more detailed drawings have been submitted.
To existing footpaths which are there. So yes, the issue is probably on the this is a less optimal solution for those that site which is yet to be built, yet to be applied for, because it's further away again. But certainly with regard to this site, it provides the most optimum solution.
With me. On the other site then, they could have a pedestrian access out onto the MOD access, which again has a set of lights, if I believe right, so they could cross there.
It will be a matter for them to consider separately, obviously. But you are correct, there are alternative solutions at that end.
If there are no other comments, we've had the recommendations moved and seconded. All those in favour of the application, please. It's unanimous. No, it's not. All those against? You're abstaining. 2 abstentions. Thank you. Moving on to planning application 2017/00329/FUL, site serve recycling, Llandau, trading estate in Llandau. Marcus, or Justine? Justine.
Thank you, Chair. This is an application seeking full permission for the retention of a single hangar at the former 2-hangar site to the south of the Llandau trading estate. There are 3 items of matters arising which I'll go through in a bit, but just to set the scene, as you may all know, this site has, and the operators have, an extensive history. The site itself was subject to a 2015 application which sought permission for a full waste recycling operation. That was black bag municipal waste, as well as paper, cardboard and plastics. That application was refused, and a subsequent enforcement notice was issued requiring that use to cease. Both the refusal of permission and the enforcement notice were appealed, and during the appeal process, before the appeal had the opportunity to be determined, the site suffered a devastating fire which has basically removed hangar B, that's the hangar on the right of the screen, removed the building in its totality. So the only remaining building on the site is hangar A. The site does have the benefit of an NRW permit, and after the fire the permit was suspended. Then that suspension was partly lifted in order to allow the operation of hangar A, and the applicant commenced the sorting and recycling of paper, cardboard and plastic in that building, and that is now the application that's being sought permission. As you can see, the application relates to only half of the site. The remainder of the site which suffered the fire doesn't form part of this application, although it's still owned by the applicant. And I've set out in the report the chronology of the site. Then going to the principal issues. Obviously, as it's a full application for determination, we have to consider every aspect of the proposal. I've set out the principle of the development and whether or not that is acceptable. And as you probably all appreciate, that the principle of waste management facilities that produce reduce waste, that goes to final disposal, that recycles as much material as possible, are favoured in national planning policy, and obviously our own local policy recognises that, albeit it still requires any new waste management facilities to be considered in the context of the land uses that surround it, and its impact still must be considered. The report, so therefore the report sets out the issues of the principle of the development, which of course are accepted in accordance with the presumption in favour of these facilities in national policy. But we then go on in detail in the report to consideration of the impact of the development, and the impact in this case would be on the land uses to the west and to the north of the site. The west is the Llandau caravan site, and to the north is the racetrack. So page 133 of the report, that's where the principal impacts are considered. So we consider noise, disturbance, hours of operation, issues of dust, issues of odour and pest control, highway safety and parking, land and groundwater pollution, and at the end, fire risk. Now, obviously, because the planning permission runs alongside the permitting scheme, we've had to be careful not to duplicate any of the controls that the permitting scheme imposes. But obviously, the reasons for the permitting scheme are slightly different to those that we consider under the planning regime. So I've taken a lot of care in the report to address where it may appear that we are duplicating the controls. I've taken care to set out why I think it's appropriate for us to control certain matters in the report. Obviously, the previous application was recommended for refusal because it was considered that issues such as pests, odour, dust, hours of operation could not be controlled adequately in view of the fact that it was a 24-hour operation that was being sought, and the fact that it was municipal black bag waste that was being sorted on the site. This application is different in that it proposes specified hours of operation, and it seeks to limit the types of materials that will be processed on the site. So it's recommended for approval with a number of conditions that seek to mitigate or control the various impacts that may be experienced by this operation, and that is in the interests of the adjoining land uses and general amenity of the area. So that takes me on to the three amendments, because obviously these conditions must be quite detailed, and they must obviously comply with the tests in the circular on planning conditions. So we've proposed some amendments to the conditions that result from, first of all, from recent contact we've had with NRW, a recent representation that we've received from the adjoining landowner, the caravan park and the racetrack, and just an amendment that I've proposed to the hours of operation. So just to take you through those, well, it would be the second on the list, but it's following on from the first report that was considered. The first matter arising relating to this application is a proposed amendment to the hours of operation, and that seeks to, I've suggested in the report that there be basically two sets of hours of operation, one that relate to the operation of the waste management and the skip storage, and the other relating to the vehicle movements. But what I've sought to do now is give both of those, or all three of the uses on the site, the same hours of operation. I think that makes the condition more precise, and that would be then more enforceable. The third of the matters arising, the second that relates to this application, is as a result of the representations from the adjoining landowners, and they raised a number of issues which I've summarised in the matters arising report. Those matters that they have raised have resulted in amendments to conditions 10 and 8, which relate to the external storage of material, and that though you can see the amendments result in a condition that states that no external storage shall take place. And then condition 16 relates to the extent of a bound surfacing on the site that is required by an amended scheme that has to be submitted. And then the final matters arising results from, as I say, from recent contact with NRW, and it's in relation to the fire prevention and mitigation strategy. And they suggested that the strategy that was submitted, or the plan that was, yeah, it is called the strategy that was submitted to us, is a plan that they have also had submitted to them, which they're not satisfied with, and they are seeking an amendment to that plan so that we're in line with that amended scheme. I propose an amendment to the condition that requires the submission of that strategy, an amended strategy to us, for us to approve, which obviously we will do in conjunction and in consultation with NRW. I'll take any questions if there are any.
If we could move through to the debate part before we do the questions. Yeah. So I'll now ask Mr. Garrett John to come up and speak on the application. When you've settled yourself down, turn your microphone on. You have 3 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members. I won't keep you any length of time because my principal reason for registering to address you this afternoon was really in response to any objections that might be received from the adjoining landowner and third parties. However, given the comprehensiveness of the committee report in front of you and the thoroughness in which obviously all the issues are addressed in turn, there's very little I can add from the applicant's perspective to add any additional information. So I wouldn't necessarily look to do that. We have worked with officers closely, obviously, to arrive at the outcome that is now before you. And the only thing I would stress is that whilst there is considerable history to this site, this is a very unique and specific proposal for a very specific use, which is for the cardboard, paper and plastics end of the business. And it will then, obviously, if approved, enable the retention of this important facility, both for the Vale and regionally, for that kind of activity, and obviously all the employment that goes with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. John. Any points of clarification from the committee? Councillor Hodges.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a brief one. Is the site safe?
Yes, it is. Yes. I'm not the operator, obviously. I'm the agent. But yes, I've been there many occasions and it is run very competently.
Thank you. I don't believe that was clarifying what the planning consultant could bring to there. Any other question or clarification on what's been discussed by our representative? Councillor Johnson.
I was just wondering if you could provide some clarification on the position regarding NRW and the fire and safety plans.
Only to reiterate what's in the report, which is clearly a fire and safety report has been submitted with the application. Natural Resources Wales have audited that as part of the process. They consider that an amended version of that is necessary to tighten that up. They clearly have a huge permitting role on this site over and above and irrespective of the planning process. So they've simply required, by condition, a further version of that report to be submitted if, of course, it's approved.
Thank you very much, Mr. John. If there's any other members wishing to clarify. I'll open the debate on the planning application. We've got 2 speakers so far. Start with Councillor Cave, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair, members. Firstly, I think we must all acknowledge that waste is everybody's responsibility, and that as a council we need to focus more time and expertise on making sure that we tackle the generation of waste at its source. And for me, I believe that we should be tackling this with the supermarkets and the manufacturers that generate the waste in the first place, and I don't think we do enough in that direction. But against this backdrop, and as already stated, there have been a number of accidental fires that have been a direct consequence of the storage and recycling of waste, at different sites across the Landau Village industrial estate. This includes another devastating fire in March of this year in Hangar B, where firefighters tackled a blaze involving approximately 200,000 tonnes of rubbish. Residents in many areas of the Vale were advised for several weeks to keep their doors and windows shut because of the dangers of acrid smoke that emanated from the site. Additionally, I've been informed that not only Vale residents suffered as a consequence, but also people living as far away as Swansea, Neathport, Talbot and Bridgend were forced to suffer the ill effects of acrid smoke, so widespread were the effects of this fire. I understand that the waste in question comes from RCT Council, who in June of this year reported further improvements to its strong recycling record after Welsh Government figures confirmed 64% of the county borough's overall waste was recycled in 2016. I wonder how much of that waste went up in smoke in the fire in March. However, the most pressing issue has already been raised as a matter of concern here, but I'll go on to say that the very real issue is the issue of fire and the lack of direction from the Chief Fire Officer in relation to this planning application. Irrespective of planning matters, previous applications and old advice, as members we are very well aware of the sad loss of life that fire can cause and how we should be particularly vigilant of many of matters where the risk of fire is present. We do not have the expertise within the Planning Committee or indeed within the Council to fully understand what needs to be done in order to ensure that we are not putting people's lives at risk, which is why we asked the Chief Fire Officer for their expert opinion. I am concerned that there is a very real risk of life and health should another fire occur, given the close proximity between the site and the caravan park. As I understand it, the distance from the application site and the nearest caravan is approximately 15 metres. As you will no doubt understand, I was surprised to discover that in SiteServe's fire protection plan there is no mention of anything that might give a fire break to the people in the caravans should another fire occur. There is no early warning system for the caravan site, no fire alarm or anything that would lead me to believe that the safety of neighbours has been given sufficient priority here. And I was horrified to find out that currently, far from there being some form of fire safety protection measures between the site and the caravans, what has instead been deemed appropriate is a biomass boiler for the purposes of burning wood. Both these are positioned between the hangar and the caravans. I asked myself, would I be happy knowing that as members of this committee we pass this application without first hearing from a trained expert in this matter? And I do note that obviously Natural Resources Wales have also been as unhappy as I've been, or at least unhappy in some respects in relation to the strategy. But I do ask that we consider deferring this decision to the next planning committee, where we could ask for the Chief Fire Officer to come here and to provide us with some guidance as to the best way forward in regards to mitigation of further fires that might be caused at this site.
Justine, please.
I'd just like to make one point of clarification, and it's something that's very recently come to our attention. So you can see that one of the matters arising amendments is as a result of a recent meeting we've had with NRW. And it was suggested to me at the meeting that a fire prevention and mitigation plan was not a specific requirement of the permit, hence why I've put the amendments to the condition on. Even though they said they weren't happy with the plan that was being submitted, it wasn't a specific requirement of the permit. I have only yesterday had confirmation from them that it is actually a requirement of the permit. So the officer I spoke to had it wrong, that it is a requirement of the permit, and she's provided me with an extract of the permit that specifically requests that the fire prevention and mitigation plan. And that is something that they, NRW themselves, will consider in accordance with their own guidance on fire prevention and mitigation. And that guidance, as far as I understand, replicates or mirrors the guidance that the fire and rescue have themselves prepared, which I've taken into account in the report. So I've taken into account both sets of guidance, and that has resulted in the stockpile heights recommendations that we have, or the condition relating to stockpile heights internally within the building. And obviously there is no this permission nor the permit allow any external storage. Now I appreciate that there is some material on site that is being stored externally. The material on the hangar B site that's still there as a result of the fire has to be moved from the site, and that's a requirement of NRW. And I understand that the applicants are in the process of getting rid of that, although some of it still remains on site. And there has been concern about a bund that is along the northern perimeter of the site, close to the racetrack. And again, under this permission, that won't be allowed to be retained on site. That would be in breach of the conditions of the planning permission. And again, it's a breach of the permit as well. And I understand NRW are pursuing that. As far as your request for a fire officer to come to the committee, I don't know that we can request that anybody come along to the committee. But I hope that you feel assured that both the permitting system and this planning application have been informed by the previous conversations I've had and contact I've had with the fire service, and the input that they have into the NRW fire prevention and mitigation process that is a continual ongoing requirement of the permit.
Councillor Cave?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Did you?
I just wanted to clarify as well on that. Essentially, the fire safety plan or management plan, not really a planning matter. Justina has brought it in as a planning matter because of her concerns around what she was told by Natural Resources Wales. We are now much more comfortable, and we were under the impression, or I'm fairly certain, that Natural Resources Wales had to consider that as part of their licensing. But the advice that Justina had been given was that they weren't, and they weren't going to condition it. Hence, we decided to try and bring it within the planning system, albeit it is perhaps slightly tenuous that it is there, that, as you'd imagine, that it's another regulatory control which would not normally sit within the planning system. So we are comfortable that now we've had confirmation from Natural Resources Wales, they have to deal with that. We are comfortable we've still got it in this report, but actually it would be extremely difficult to refuse the application, for example, on grounds that they hadn't submitted a fire management plan, because it is beyond the control of the planning system.
Councillor Cave?
Yes, thank you for those points of clarification, and I do thank you for bringing this report in the condition that it is. It's a very thorough report, and it outlines many of the serious concerns that a large number of people have about this application. But unfortunately, I've absolutely no faith in Natural Resources Wales as a large body of other people. I don't think there's anybody that I've spoken to since I became a new councillor in May that has said not even one complimentary thing about this organisation. In fact, I don't believe that they're fit for purpose. And I think the Welsh Government should seriously look at this organisation as a matter of urgency and try and put something in that has teeth, that can actually make a difference. Because I can see what you're saying, and it's great that we've now got clarification that they do know that this strategy is under their control. And it seems bizarre to me that the organisation, that any organisation wouldn't know what issues were under their control and were not under their control. And for me, it just outlines again the ineptitude of Natural Resources Wales.
Councillor Thomas next.
Mine, I think, is somewhat more straightforward. Page 3 of the amendments, Amendment 3. I can understand the intent, but I think the wording, again, is a problem here. as it was earlier in this meeting. You say Monday to Friday, limiting the hours, you say Monday to Friday 0700 to 1800, excluding bank holidays and public holidays, Saturday 7 till 4, and then not at all on a Sunday. The implication of that, I believe, is that that they shouldn't be operating on a bank holiday or public holiday. However, the wording can be taken to mean that there is no restriction to working on a public holiday or a bank holiday, and therefore they could operate for 24 hours on a bank holiday or a public holiday. It's poorly worded. It could be rectified simply by putting not at all on a Sunday, a bank holiday or a public holiday. Just moving that phrase down to the bottom. The way it's worded at the moment is meaningless.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Marcus?
It's important to note these conditions have to be written in the negative, and that's why, if you notice, it says the use of the site outside of the the use of the site for the storage of commercial vehicles and other activities shall not be carried out outside of the following specified hours. So that is Monday to Friday, 7 in the morning till 6 at night, excluding bank holidays and public holidays. No, it shall not be carried out. It shall not be carried out outside of the following specified hours. I have to say that's the standard condition that is used to control hours, as recommended by Welsh Government in its standard condition procedure. So I understand the concern, and I know it appears strange, but it has to be written legally over years and years and years. This has been done in this way to set out in the negative, and there's been loads of appeal decisions all around how this is written. So it's come in this form. Yeah.
I think we've had the clarification on that, although I do share some of your thoughts on the way wording is done generally to make it accessible, but I guess there's a legally enforced side to the permit, so it's the legal language that's important. Councillor Johnson's next on my list.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I also have concerns about Natural Resources Wales not being always as good as they could be on many things, but two queries really. Firstly, just regarding exactly how the inspection and enforcement regimes will work between us and Natural Resources Wales in terms of making sure that we keep our side of the bargain, and secondly, the neighbours in one of the appendices, I think it's white, young, green, on the final page, page 165, they do give a series of issues they would like us to consider in the event of permission being granted. I was just wondering if the officers could take us through those quickly and explain which of those have been dealt with as part of the various conditions and which of those would still be outstanding or of concern to the local residents and businesses surrounding the estate. Thank you.
Justine?
Right, so I think that you as a committee all understand the permitting scheme, that it's an ongoing rolling process whereby NRW inspect installations such as this to ensure that they are complying with their permit, and I think it's up to NRW how often those site inspections take place and what those site inspections cover. I think that they can respond to issues that arise and require the operator to provide an assessment of a particular issue, and then if the assessment produces a series of mitigation measures that should be introduced, then NRW can require them to introduce those mitigation measures. Depending on the type of installation, it may be the case that these sites are this type of site in particular might be inspected maybe quarterly. That's the suggestion that has been put to me, that they ordinarily they would be inspected on a sort of 4 times a year basis. But more often, if complaints are made to NRW and allegations about non-compliance with the permit, so they can inspect them more frequently if there are issues, and that's what they have done on this site. Now, as for the planning regime, we would not carry out those regular inspections. It's almost like front-loading the decision-making process, and we place a series of conditions on a planning permission, and if those conditions are not complied with, only then would we inspect the site to establish whether or not a breach of the condition has occurred. We have no opportunity to vary the conditions once they've been imposed, and that's why the two systems have to run alongside each other and have to not duplicate each other's controls, because one operates very differently to the other. As for the matters that have been raised by the third party, these mirror to some degree the concerns that were raised as matters arising. Do you want me to go through each one of them? And so there are 7 or I suppose 9 matters that have been raised. First, limiting the type of material. Well, that's what we have done. We've limited the type of material to just paper, plastic and cardboard. Limiting the quantity of materials. Now, even though the NRW permit allows 75,000 tonnes, it was proposed as part of the application that they would only be processing 50,000 tonnes, and on that basis we've considered the proposal and put a condition on limiting the tonnage that can be received on the site each year. What we've also done is imposed a condition stating how much material can be on site at any one time, so as to limit the instances of if the material that's to go elsewhere, if there is an issue there with the exportation of that material, new material can't be brought on until that material goes off site, and that's been imposed to mitigate any amenity issues, but primarily to stop a build-up of material that may result in combustion or incidents of fire. We've obviously you've seen the condition relating to stockpile sizes and the condition that says only material can only be stored and processed internally. So all of those suite of conditions are intended to limit the amount of material that can be on site at any one time, and it's encouraging a high turnover of material. To ensure no waste is stored, deposited or transferred externally, that's a requirement of both the planning permission conditions and the permit. They can't store or process any of the paper, plastic and cardboard externally. To ensure no reception of black bag waste, we've already dealt with that. There's no black bag waste to be received on the site. That's controlled by the condition. Hazardous waste, again, that's dealt with by the paper, plastic, cardboard condition. The acoustic fence, we've got a condition imposed on the permission that requires details of the 3 metre or a minimum height of 3 metre acoustic fence, and we want to make sure that that fence is fit for the purpose in which it's intended. On the previous scheme, they did provide us with details of the fence, and those weren't submitted with this application, hence our request for those details. And then the number 7 deals with fire prevention mitigation plan. I think we've addressed that in the discussions we've already had. Hours of operation, there is an hours of operation condition. The applicant was seeking to start vehicle movements about the site at 6 a.m. Our environmental health officer has considered that proposal in detail, and you can see her comment in the report that that proposal goes against their own noise assessment that suggests that only daytime hours, which start at 7 a.m, should be imposed on any operations on the site, and ensure that the biomass boiler is not used for the combustion of waste. Well, it's the biomass boiler isn't there to burn waste. It's there to provide a source of heat and hot water to the offices that are ancillary to the use that's proposed. It is a matter that is being investigated and controlled by both our environmental health officers and NRW. I think they're both looking into this and have looked into this matter in the past. It isn't something that we can control under planning. There are permitted development rights for the installation of these types of biomass boilers. the intention is for it not to burn waste that it receives onto the site. And having been there to the site a few times, I've never seen that boiler, the burner burning waste material, only wood, which is what it's intended to do. And I think that was everything then. Yeah, that was all the matters there.
Councillor Wilkinson.
I'm going to second Councillor Cave's motion. You haven't convinced me that that site is not dangerous. It's still being cleared where that fire was. I've listened to you saying you've asked questions and you've had answers to some of them. You've had conversations. Well, we haven't had any conversations at all. I am not happy with that site at all. There has been too much trouble there, and I'm going to support Councillor Cave.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkinson. I've got a couple of other speakers and I'll come to the motion. Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Chair. I just specifically want to look at condition 14. That obviously relates to the boundary between this site and the caravan site. And I'm trying to get the confidence that what is proposed will actually protect the caravan occupiers should, unfortunately, a further fire, which will be number 3, breaks out. If we're correct that the caravans or the site boundary...
I believe it's number 4. I've just been...
Sorry?
Fire number 4, I've heard from this side.
Fire number 4.
Clarified.
If it's correct that the boundary or the caravans are only 15 metres from the edge of this building, and just so you all know, because I always say it, this building here is longer than 15 metres, so that's the end of the hangar, and that's where the caravans could be. A acoustic fence invariably is a timber fence. Now, a 3-metre high timber fence with the intensity of the fires that we have seen will be an added hazard, to say the very least. So even if we have to accept this, I think that we need to make sure that that acoustic fence is 100% fireproof, because if it catches on fire, heaven help the people that are within 10, 20, 30 metres. So I'd recommend that as an amendment to the condition.
Thank you, Councillor Parker.
Sorry, just to say, I did actually try to check up on Section 13 of the building regulations, and they do refer to the intensity of the fire in understanding exactly what the fire precaution works should be, but I'm afraid it's so complicated that I clearly couldn't work it out. But if we made sure that the fireproofing of that fence was in accordance with current building regulation standards, and I say that advisedly because I'm not 100% sure we can do it, that would give us the teeth to actually look after and safeguard the caravanners.
Thank you, Councillor Parker. Justine?
We can certainly amend the condition to perhaps suggest details of a fireproof acoustic fence be submitted, and we can just make sure that whatever they submit to us demonstrates that the materials they're proposing are fireproof.
Councillor Bird.
Thank you, Chair. We have, or not we, Justina and the team have done an awful lot of work on this application, as I'm sure you can appreciate. And my worry is that if we don't give planning permission tonight, it will go straight to appeal, and that a permission is granted with no or not suitable conditions. I am happy that these conditions do tie the application down pretty tightly, and certainly with all the amendments that have come out tonight, I am convinced that this is about as safe as we can get this operation. So with that in mind, I will recommend that we go with the officer's recommendation and approve, subject to the conditions being altered as discussed tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Bird. Councillor Hodges.
Thank you, Chairman. A test for me when I look at a planning application is what's the history of the site? And we look at actions being taken without planning permission, we look at enforcement action, and then we see mitigation and control supposedly by NRW, and then we have a fire, or as I'm now told, a fourth fire. I've got to be convinced that this site is safe, which is why I asked the agent the question. And I'm sorry, I can't see that it is, and I can't see that the mitigation to the conditions, whilst possibly helpful, does not satisfy me. To hear the hangar B burnt to the ground, hasn't even been properly removed yet, 7 months on, doesn't give me a lot of confidence. To hear that we as a planning authority, and fair play to the officers, they've tried to do something. We're talking about heights of stored material inside and out. That implies to me that they are concerned about a further fire. And this is sort of mitigation or something to help that not happen. Now, I'm not convinced. And if it takes the fact that we've had a member suggest that we defer for far more information and far more confidence being given to us as a planning committee, I certainly will back that. But I'm not convinced. And NRW frightened me.
Thank you, Councillor Hodges. I'm certainly going to ask Marcus to comment on the nature of a motion around deferment, but if I get Councillor King's contribution first.
Thank you, Chair. The meeting an hour ago we were discussing Planning Committee overturning officers' recommendations, so it's ironic that here we are a little while later contemplating exactly that. And I share the concerns that others have expressed that that history is not actually on the side of this application or this operator at all. And it's in my interpretation, it's all a question of who's responsible for what, and we're being asked to look at planning consent and our controls through planning. There are bits that are part of the Fire Authority, and there are bits that are part of National Resources Wales. I have to say I have considerably more faith in the Fire Authority than I have in National Resources Wales, but again I come back to the history. It hasn't worked terribly well so far. And I don't know what we may be able to do outside of this meeting, but because I really would like National Resources Wales to inspire me with a darn sight more confidence than they do. But if it's down to the planning decision, that's the dilemma we've got. Is that it appears that we really ought to follow officers' recommendations, and yet I really don't feel at all confident.
Thank you. Marcus, please.
I have to say I completely understand some members' concerns around this. The difficulty you have, and I have to tell you this legally, is that the minute you go to an appeal decision where you make reference to concerns about natural resources Wales, and it might be just in the way that you're not satisfied that the fire control measures are in place and what have you, you will immediately be smacked down by the inspector. It's happened to us before. An inspector will have no regard for any concerns you might have about another regulator in terms of how they perform. As an authority, we have to assume that a regulator who is employed and controlled by Welsh Government has to be assumed to be doing its job properly, and that is what the planning inspector will do. So any concerns you might have around that, and I completely understand those concerns, they will be immediately cast aside by a planning inspector. And therefore, we will have extremely difficult grounds to refuse this application, because what we have tried to do here is to tie the operator into a position where we think that if they operate in this way, they will be safe. The key issue which Justina has just said to me is that what Natural Resources Wales have said is that all of their concerns in the past were in relation to Hangar B, where the black bag waste was being sorted and stored. They haven't served any enforcement notices on Hangar A, where previously they were operating this use without planning permission. So it's not a comfort, I appreciate that, but all I can say to you is that the concerns around fires and other issues arose from the black bag waste, not from disuse. So that's really all I can say to you. Do you want, yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to add a bit to the request for the fire service to... Did you want them to come along to committee or just give comments on... Because obviously we can't... You answer the question.
Yeah, I'm just asking for us to have some more clarity and some more confidence in the ability to both stop fires and then safeguard lives if a fire should start.
So we can certainly ask the fire service any questions or concerns that we may have. That can be done through the process of the fire mitigation and prevention plan that we've asked details for. And obviously we'll consider that plan in consultation with NRW, but we can also ask the fire service and ask them in some detail about what their comments are about the proposal for fire prevention and mitigation on the site. They can't themselves impose any controls or restrictions or any conditions, if you like, on the operator. They just have to rely on the regulatory bodies such as NRW and us to make sure that incidents of fire don't occur. So all they can really do is give us advice based on their own guidance. With regard to what's happened at the site, I understand from NRW that they are still in the process of investigating the fire and coming to the conclusion as to whether or not somebody ought to be prosecuted. I don't know what stage they're at with that, but they could give us very little comment on what's happening with that investigation. The only other thing I can say is that I'm your enforcement officer and I've suggested a series of conditions that I'm comfortable are in accordance with the guidance which I've spoken to the fire service in depth about. We are restricting the type of material that can go onto the site, and the type of material that will go on has a significantly less likelihood that it will combust compared to the black bag waste. The controls we've imposed require a high turnover of material so that there is, again, the whole issue of combustion is much reduced as a result of that. And the controls on stockpile sizes, that's something that can quite easily, I can quite easily establish that. They're very, I've found them quite easy to interpret, and I can go on site, look at stockpile sizes, look at separation distances as well of stockpile sizes, and we're saying no external storage whatsoever. And if they breach those conditions, we've got our powers. We don't have to rely on NRW to pursue those matters. We can pursue them ourselves. We have our own environmental health officers that can give us advice on those matters. And obviously, we are aware of the history of the operators of the site. And we're aware that we're granting a permission for continued waste management, but we're granting that, I hope, in a way that is very controlled, and that with a suite of conditions that we can rely on and can enforce if needs be.
And one on top of this is that during the course of looking at this application and coming to these, drafting these very long and detailed conditions, Justina has shared those conditions with both the operator and neighbours who were concerned. We haven't had any objections from the operators, and neighbours who raised some concerns have been satisfied by what Justina has built into them. It's important to note, if this did go to appeal, I can pretty much guarantee that what you would find is an inspector would say if any condition was suggested by us was crossed over other regulatory bodies' boundaries, so for example the fire management plan, they would just strike it out like that, because their view is that we should not be getting involved in another regulatory body's controls. So we've done, the point I think Justina is trying to make to you is we have a belt and braces approach here, which allows us, should there be real concerns about what's going on there, were NRW not to do anything about it, we can take our own action. If we end up going to appeal, and it is granted on appeal, and I think Justina's gone through the point that actually under strict planning policy terms, there's very little ground to stand against it. So it is likely, I have to say, more than likely than not, an inspector would probably find in favour of it. If that were to happen, and I don't often say that, you'll know that, those of you who are on the committee know that I don't often say that, but the policy situation is so strong here, I'd struggle to see how we could get into that position. The situation is that an inspector would cast aside all those extra conditions that are there, which perhaps, I won't say they necessarily cross right across, but are there to give some surety and comfort to neighbours that there are controls there. They would cast those aside. So that's an important point to make.
Thank you, Marcus. I have 4 people who've said they want to speak. Now 5 people who want to speak. If I can get through those in order, please. Councillor Penrose. If you turn your microphone off, Christine.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, if we are minded to approve this application, my concern is over the conditions and how we're going to implement those conditions. If we take condition 5, the amount of waste which we're saying is 50,000 tonnes per annum, based on the statistics which Councillor Kay quoted with regard to the fire previously, which was estimated a lot more than that, 50,000 tonnes per annum equates to obviously 1,000 tonnes per week, which equates to probably 100 heavy goods vehicle movements. If we look at condition 6, 4,500 tonnes at any time, you could say that's 4.5 weeks processing, but in reality it's not, because the 4.5 weeks would assume no more comes in during that time. So it's probably more likely to be 2 weeks. We also state that we're going to ask them to keep records of the tonnage coming in and going out. My question is, how are we going to monitor all this? I appreciate that Justina has said that she can pop down and see how high the things are, but it's critical that if we do approve this, that this waste material movement and storage is monitored, which is quite intensive. How do we plan about going about that?
Justine?
Well, the condition 7, I've based that on conditions that have been used on things like holiday lets, where the owners of the holiday lets are required to keep a register. So the condition is, the wording of it is based around that, which is the one that's suggested in the circular. They have to keep these records anyway for the purposes of their permit. NRW require them to keep them, and they can be inspected at any time. And obviously we've said in the condition that they should be made available to us on request. We've required that there be no external storage, so it'll be completely apparent to us when first going to the site that if they have an issue with regard to too much waste being on site, if any of it is being stored outside, that's a straightforward, easy breach for us to monitor. And then in addition to what I've already said about stockpile sizes, again, that's an easy one for us to monitor, in that if you've got too much material in the hangar, the stockpiles will be too close together, they will be too high, and again, that's an easy one for us to monitor. So there's that suite of conditions is a quite detailed mechanism for us to ensure that they don't exceed the 50,000 tonnes that are proposed, or the 4,500 tonnes on site at any one time. So simply looking at issues of external storage, stockpile sizes, and the records that they have to keep in any event for NRW, I think that those is, it's a belt and braces approach to us monitoring the amount of material processed and on site at any one time.
Sure.
I mean, fine, I appreciate everything you're saying. What I'm asked to be written in the conditions that we would do it. I think we would have to inspect those records monthly as a minimum. Otherwise, I appreciate it says kept in perpetuity, but at the end of the day, we do have to monitor to ensure that the tonnages don't exceed. And I would think a month is a realistic time to inspect those records. It wouldn't take time to inspect those records, but at least we can then satisfy ourselves and the general public that these tonnages are going to be exceeded.
Councillor Bird.
Thank you, Chair. I did actually, when I was first made aware of this application, write to Leslie Griffiths and raise my grave concerns over NRW and the state of their permitting procedure. I had a response back saying that they are working closely with our planning department on this particular application, and they actually do admit, or she did admit, that they have issues with their permitting procedure and that they are currently reviewing it, but it didn't give me much hope on that. But I think what Bob is talking about, really, we are trying to do, I know we're all concerned about this, but we are trying to do NRW's work here. The monitoring of the licence. But who is going to pay for that, Bob?
We do one at a time, please, gents.
We have no method of charging for this, whereas there is a licence fee which is deemed to pay for that inspection that NRW charge. We don't charge a fee. We couldn't. How would we afford as a council to send somebody down there on a fortnightly or monthly basis to inspect their logbooks when, after all, it is a Welsh Government NRW responsibility? They are issuing the licence. It will be under their terms, and it is their staff's responsibility to check those terms are being adhered to. This is not a planning thing that we can say, you know, we inspect the ongoing. It's an everyday running thing, and I certainly disagree with you there, Bob, that it is our responsibility.
Briefly, if you may.
Yeah, but in that case, why are we going for an amount of tonnage which is less than NRW? If we expect NRW, we might as well just approve the 75,000 tonnes per annum, which the licence is being granted. But we're imposing our conditions, and at the end of the day, to satisfy a planning application being approved. So I think we've got two things. One is the permit that it does. The other thing is us to ensure that the conditions we're imposing are adhered to. And to be honest with you, I think cost is a pretty poor argument to use on this one. Sorry, Jonathan, but it doesn't take long for an officer once a month. They could even submit them to us to ensure that their records are correct and that amount of tonnage isn't. That could be, in this electronic age, just be put across us each month. You know.
If I could move on, I've got a number of councillors who want to make a point. If I can come back to officers after I've heard from a few more and try and clear through my list a little bit more. I don't think we'll lose the stream on this. Councillor Parker and then Councillor Burnett.
Yeah, I'm thinking how we can manage to control this a little bit more. And I know I quite often suggest this, and it is a difficult one, but maybe the condition relating to the fire management plan and the fire protection wall, because I'm going to call it that rather than an acoustic wall, should come back to committee for ratification and consideration. And if that was included, I would happily second Jonathan's proposal.
As in approving application, but subject to that being submitted as a set.
Conditions coming back to the committee.
Right.
Within the reasons that just...
Councillor Burnett, and then if we get a response on all those points, I think we're following a similar theme.
I think we all accept that when we're trying to achieve high levels of recycling, there actually needs to be facilities to support that. But they are fraught with problems, and I'm finding it very, very difficult to support this application because I've still got a lot of concerns. I'd be grateful for some clarification around the amended condition 9, if possible, which is talking about the fire prevention and mitigation plan. I have to slightly disagree with Councillor Parker in that there's not a lot of point bringing a fire prevention and mitigation plan back to this committee because we've already said that we are not experts. So we wouldn't know whether it was a good plan or not. What I would like to know, because this talks about within 1 month of the date of this consent, a fire prevention and mitigation strategy shall be submitted to and approved in writing by the local planning authority. Can you help me to understand how you will decide whether that's a fire prevention mitigation strategy that should be approved. Who will you talk to? Will you take on board the opinions of the local fire and rescue service as to whether or not this organisation is planning to do absolutely everything it possibly could to prevent and mitigate fire? And yeah, I'd be a lot happier if we already had a signed off one of those, with the relevant bodies having agreed that it was a good plan. So I'm looking for more information about what is the process of getting a 100% solid fire prevention and mitigation strategy linked to this, or because it says within 1 month the date of this consent it will be submitted and approved. How much wriggle room have we got to be able to say, well, actually this isn't good enough, we're not signing it off, and not sign it off until the people who are in the know actually agree that it's a good plan as well.
Marcus, in relation to obviously Bob's point, Andrew's point, and Liz's point, maybe you could comment, please.
Okay, I'll start with Bob's point about conditions. Obviously, Justina's tried to point out that there is a requirement on this operator to keep records, to comply with its licence under Natural Resources Wales. I understand the limit of 50 was put on by us because that is what they have asked for in their stock documentation that is submitted with it, and the figures that Natural Resources Wales use in their licensing are set within bands. So the band is X amount to 75,000. So it would allow essentially that amount. So we have gone with what the applicant has said at 50, because that is what they said they can do. In terms of the condition monitoring, yes, we can ask them, certainly in the first few months, to submit to us what has gone through their gates and to provide us with information around that. And that would be not a particularly onerous task. I think what we couldn't guarantee we could do is that an officer can get there, for example, every month to monitor it, albeit that I think what we could say is within the first few months of operation, an officer could certainly go past and just check that things are operating. And on top of that, we could require them to send us the details monthly to say what's going through there, so we can see if they are, for example, getting through 10,000 tons in a month. We know that they're going to breach the condition very, very quickly. So that there's no reason why we couldn't do that. And obviously, we would corroborate that with Natural Resources Wales too, because they should be able to obtain the same information because they require it. So that shouldn't be an issue, and I can't see that as being a problem for us doing that. In terms of the issue that Councillor Burnett, and I haven't missed anything out there. Have I missed anything? Have I covered it all, that side of it?
Whether or not with this condition that Andrew was talking about, I mean, the sort of.
I personally, and I think Councillor Burnett's hit the nail on the head there. The reality is we would rely, and I suppose those two questions are going to be related. So if I deal with Councillor Parker's question after I've dealt with Councillor Burnett's, they'll make more sense perhaps. Councillor Burnett has asked the question, who would we speak to? Because we're not experts in fire safety and fire management, so who would we speak to get satisfaction that the report is suitable? And we would speak to Natural Resources Wales, but we would also speak to the fire service, because the fire service, albeit it says in here haven't responded to the application, which is a bit disappointing. I think someone mentioned that it was a bit disappointing. Actually, Justina has been constantly speaking to the fire service during the course of the enforcement case on this site, and we have very close contact with them, and we wouldn't allow anything which the fire service were not happy with. So they would be a key part of, or a key party in assessing anything that came through as a fire management plan. Because if they were concerned about anything, we would just go straight back to them. Now, if after, I think the condition is worded in a way that says within 1 month the date of this permission, there's two issues here. If they didn't do it and they were carrying on operating, we just serve an enforcement notice on them to stop them. But secondly, Natural Resources, it's been clarified to us that Natural Resources Wales have a similar condition on their licence. So the operators are going to have to satisfy Natural Resources Wales, or they will stop them as well. The reason we originally put this here was we were concerned there wasn't going to be a condition from Natural Resources Wales, as I said. So this is pretty much a belt and braces approach, that if the operator doesn't satisfy this condition or the condition of Natural Resources Wales, they're going to have two regulatory authorities coming after them and seeking them to stop operations on site. And in this particular case, I would suggest that we would serve what's known as a stop notice. We have powers to serve a temporary stop notice for 28 days, but we also have powers to serve a permanent stop notice if nothing happens, and we'd have to decide at that time what we would do, but we'd certainly serve one of them. Because obviously we would have concerns that that's a fundamental part of what's being done here. So coming back to Andrew's question, Councillor Parker's question about should it come back to committee, I think if we had the views of the Fire Authority and Natural Resources Wales and they supported the plan, I'm not sure what the committee would gain by determining it themselves, other than perhaps adding slightly to the delay of getting it authorised. And members can correct me if I'm wrong here, and I have nothing against it coming back to committee, but I'm not sure what you'd gain, because they're so very technical. It's not a matter of judgment as such. If it'll either comply with what the consultees say, or it won't, essentially. If it doesn't comply, we won't agree it, and we'll have to stop them, or they'll have to submit a new plan. So I'll leave that up to you. But my own view is that it's such a very technical question. I don't know what committee would gain by having it on committee.
Briefly, Councillor Parker.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. Yeah, in fact, the right thing is for you to come back and give us a report, to be honest. We're all curious as to what the way it's going to go. And if we can have a report, I think that would give us more confidence than us actually trying to understand a report that we will not understand.
I think this is one of the very few cases where a report back from Justina's enforcement team, perhaps in about 3 or 4 months afterwards, to update members, if it were to be granted, I have to say, if it were to be granted, and update members on what has happened would be extremely useful to you. And I'm quite happy that we could do that.
Councillor Burnett, and then I've got Councillor Rowlands on my list.
I was reassured in part by your answer. You know me. The answer you get tends to depend upon the question you ask. And to ask the Fire and Rescue Service if they're okay with a plan is very different to asking them if the plan is as good as it could be. So if I could request that when they are consulted, that they are asked if the plan is as good as it could be, and are there suggestions they could make to strengthen it, rather than can you have a look at this, is it okay? And I think that as a planning authority is probably as far as we can go, but I just want every single I dotted and every T crossed in relation to this application.
Marcus?
I think that's a very fair request. I'd be amazed if the fire service, having had to deal with what they've dealt with here, weren't jumping on us straight away if they felt that they could do more. But we will certainly ask that question. This isn't just what you're looking at. Can anything more be done to make this safer? And we'll certainly ask that question.
Councillor Parker, can I just confirm you're still seconding offshore recommendations, but withdrawing the amendment that you had said before?
But including on 14 the recommendation for the fireproofing of the firewall.
Councillor Bird has said with the conditions as discussed. So, Councillor Rowlands.
Can I just clarify the process, or what the process will be for the paper? Because I know I used to work in this sort of industry over a year ago, and they tend to shred paper, and when you shred, well, it happened a couple of years ago for the company I used to work for, the whole depot went up in flames when they shredded the paper, and we lost the depot. So I just wanted will they be shredding the paper, or will it just be coming in as on A4 sheets of paper?
My understanding is they don't do any shredding on site. What they do is they receive the waste in, they remove any, what they refer to as contaminants. So when I say that, I mean like staples and other bits of waste that have got in there. And they've got a picking line to do that. and then they bale it, and then it's exported off-site then in the bales.
Councillor Penrose.
Sorry, it's only one for Marcus because I think we're on the same wavelength. But I'd just like to ask, is Marcus of a mind and Justina that we're going to alter condition 7 to include, rather than say within 1 week if asked, we were discussing asking on a regular basis the information be submitted.
Marcus?
I would suggest we don't do that to the actual condition, because if we get to a point where we're satisfied they're not, we can certainly put a regime in place to do that, but I think that condition allows us to do that, and we certainly wouldn't want to be in a position in perhaps 18 months' time that we were asking constantly every month for that material to come through if there wasn't. They have to provide this information to Natural Resources Wales. I know where the concerns of members are, that Natural Resources Wales haven't delivered on previous promises. But if we were satisfied that the site was operating, we have to have regard to the fact that unless the neighbours come to us and say it's all gone haywire again, we have to be satisfied that perhaps our close monitoring of the first few months has achieved its purpose. And I will say to you, and this is a point no one else has raised, the neighbours are particularly, and they should be, are particularly vociferous about looking what goes on this site and making sure that what happens is in compliance. The minute anything does happen there untoward, we get contact from the neighbour, and rightly so, and Justina is in very close contact with that neighbour and has been, as has the enforcement officer. So there is a secondary measure there that we do know that the owners of the caravan site will be in touch with us should they have any concerns about what's happening. So I think rather than amend that condition, which could put us in a very difficult position in a few years' time, we're better keeping it there, but promising that there will be a close monitoring exercise carried on for the first few months of the operation, if that's okay. Richard is very right, actually, that if we were to specify a timescale, actually at the moment we could go in there every week and ask for that information. If we specified one monthly, for example, we could actually be. I think in terms of the agent, to be fair to the agent is a planning agent who's here to represent them in terms of their planning application. It would be a matter for the site operators rather than that planning agent. The operators haven't objected to any of the conditions, I'm assuming, on that basis, and they've had them, so they've seen the conditions and what was in front of them, that they find them acceptable.
I've got Councillor Hodges next. Thank you.
That's just raised another question in my mind. The question I've got is there's a number of conditions here. And 5 starts with the amount of waste material received, sorted, stored and exported should not exceed the 50,000. That's been explained, 50,000 tonnes a year. And that is effectively our limit and had been agreed by the operator. I'm just wondering, was that specifically to put it under the limit for an EIA, which is inferred within the paperwork here, that if it had been higher, an EIA might have been more automatic. Now, with a view to the 50,000 tonnes limit and the register, which will regulate the amount and record in and out and everything like that, we then go on to 8, which actually says about the storage of piles in bales, how high, how close to each other, how far away from everything else, inside and out and everything like that. Now, that's quite specific numbers. And I'm not a mathematician, and I'm not going to try and work it out. Will that figure, has that been worked out in it to enable them to get their 50,000 tonnes? Or is it more? Or is it less? That's basically.
Thank you.
The figures that are quoted in the amended condition 8, and the figures haven't been changed, we've just taken out the reference to external storage. They're taken from the guidance from NRW and from the fire service use on recommended stockpile heights and sizes and separation. Yeah, so it's not, I haven't done a calculation to see if that will achieve the 50,000 tonnes, because obviously it depends on how quickly they could turn the material quite quickly, which would mean maybe that there aren't any stockpiles. Maybe the material is taken off as soon as it's baled and it comes on as baled and then ready to be exported. So no, I haven't done that calculation. It's just purely taken from the guidance.
Thanks for that briefly. I mean, I didn't expect you to, but my concern is if it doesn't give them the 50,000, then are we pushing them towards a breach? And if it gives them over 50,000, are we then going to have our limit breached if they decide that they want to be naughty, shall I say, because we do have a history of naughtiness on the site. So I'm just wondering if we're actually pushing them one way or pulling them the other. But I understand that there needs to be clearance distances and everything for fire safety. But I'm just wondering if the 50,000 tonnes that we're now insisted upon was purely to get away from an EIA, which has been problematic for this council in other things in the past.
Marcus, please.
Thank you, Chair. I completely understand it, and it would be great if we could have a sort of figure that they sat within and you could just go on site and say it straight away. The difficulty is, obviously, I'm sure we all know this, that this talks about volumes and the weight of the different materials is going to be different, so you couldn't do that, unfortunately. But I think what this does is set out the best practice as has been given to us in terms of fire safety. That's not to encourage them to necessarily exceed that. This is just best practice, and therefore what has been recommended to us in terms of the storage inside the building to ensure you minimise the risk of possible fire. In terms of the 50,000 tonnes, no is the easy answer. This type of use would fall within Schedule 2 of the EIA regulations, I believe, and therefore it's a judgment call anyway. But the 50,000 tonnes is not a hard and fast figure set, for example, in any of the legislation, which you have to make a decision on and say, right, one is within Schedule 1, therefore definitely require an EIA. One is in Schedule 2, where a lot of other factors kick in and are measured. So every application we have, and I mean every application, we do make an assessment on whether or not an EIA is necessary. We're duty bound, so the 12 or 1,300 applications a year, we do that. They're very simple with a household extension, clearly, but with your bigger applications and this type of application, they are more complex. You can apply for what's called a screening opinion separately to decide whether or not, and that's a formal opinion to decide if it needs an EIA, but in any event, we are duty bound to screen all these. And whether the view would be whether it was 70 tonnes, or 70,000 tonnes or 50,000 tonnes, the screening would be pretty much the same. It wouldn't have affected that figure. I think that's a bit of a flippant throwaway comment by the agent working for the neighbours, especially around before we'd done a lot of work around conditions and the concerns around how much material was on the site. I can categorically say we've assessed this and it doesn't need an EIA, and if it were higher, the same answer would be given to you. If it was extremely high, at 200, 300,000 tonnes, it might be a different answer. But what we are considering 50,000 tonnes, the applicant has said that. They've said that for a reason. An EIA wouldn't add anything to this in terms of, that's the final point I wanted to make, in terms of the way this has been looked at and the way it's been assessed, whether it was subject to an environmental impact assessment or not, exactly the same consideration has gone into this application. It's been very, very thoroughly considered at all levels and with all the consultees. So, we are fully aware of how sensitive what has gone on here is because of the history, and it wouldn't have made an iota of difference one way or the other.
Thank you very much. We have two active motions in front of the committee. I'll take them in the order that they were proposed and seconded. So the first was with regard to, if there are no other contributions, the first was with regard to the deferment of the application pending more detailed information or guidance on the fire protection measures and plans. If I've not misrepresented that, could I see all those in favour of a deferment? 4. All those against? 9. Any abstentions? I think 1 abstention. So that motion falls. All those in favour of the second motion, which is to go with officer recommendations with the conditions, obviously as discussed, amended on the application. All those in favour of that, please. And those against? 3. And those abstaining? The plan application passes. Thank you very much. I can reassure members that the clock has not been put back an hour, although we had a number of contributions. That brings us to an end of this meeting. Thank you very much for accommodating the date change as well. I look forward to seeing you in December. Thank you.